welcome to everyone. Welcome to this final panel of the EIB GDN conference on assessing the development impacts of private sector investments. This session concludes our discussions with a debate on how impact assessments are and can be used to improve good practices within institutions and impact of their activities. We have and we will have 5 distinguished panelists. And for the sake of time, if they allow me, I will simply refer all of you to the conference program and to their CVs instead of starting off with a necessarily and deservedly lengthy presentation of all their qualifications. You will find all that on the CVs, and I welcome Rabah, who was able to connect. So we are all there. Let me just mention that Marie Garder, Executive Director of 3IE, was initially on the panel, but finally couldn't make it and apologizes for not being with us. To open up the discussion, and I'll do that, but I also invite all panelists to think out of the box and not feel constrained by my own remarks. I would like to observe that evaluations of impact do serve and can be used for 3 complementary but very distinct functions. There is a function of accountability to a variety of stakeholders, taxpayers, investors, beneficiaries, and others. Yesterday's discussion mentioned, for example, that a failure to demonstrate impact would actually cut the sources of funding for private impact investors. So this is part of the accountability function. The second function is a function of knowledge creation about what most effectively creates desired impacts, what works, what doesn't. And one of the working assumptions is that such knowledge has a public good value and can be generalized, at least to some extent, to a variety of other geographical, institutional, and thematic contexts. And there is a function of learning within organizations and possibly of feedback loops that help improve decisions, projects, and implementations. However, when one talks about evaluations, one does not generally differentiate between these 3 functions, as if they were fully aligned. But in fact, they might have quite different implications in terms of the nature of the work, the processes, the timing, the requirements in terms of independence, in terms of transparency, the products of evaluations, and their use. It may well be the case that the criteria for what makes a good evaluation are not fully consistent across users. And again, when we discussed yesterday, Issa, Faye, and Jean-Michel Severino insisted. There is echo. Can you cut your mic? Thank you. In that discussion, Issa Faye and Jean-Michel Severino insisted in their interaction with François that there was a high penalty when impact investors were unable to demonstrate impact, because that would mean closing their access to their own investors. Hence, they said good and rigorous ex post impact evaluations play a defining role. Yes, but what exactly does good and rigorous mean? How much academic robustness does accountability, for example, or rather the perception of accountability, require? All this was left a little bit unclear. My impression, more or less confirmed by the discussion so far, is that the function of knowledge creation about what works or not is implicitly recognized as the defining one for evaluations. And I would personally beg to differ. I would insist more on how one might better learn from evaluations within institutions, and how one could create a continuum of interactions between actions and decisions and evaluative research within these institutions. So our panel will address some of these aspects and others along the value chain that goes from production of impact evaluation to their users. We have agreed between us on an order that more or less takes us along that value chain. We have got till 3:45 p.m. and at 3:45 p.m. I will give the floor immediately, smoothly, to the EIB Vice President Ricardo Mourinho and to François Bourguignon to take us through the takeaways of this conference and lead us to its conclusions. So let me ask all panelists to be as brief as they can and stick within a time budget of up to 5 minutes or less, so that we can have a lively discussion, including participants through the comments and questions that I invite them to share with us on the chat. Let me now give the floor to Francois to start us up. Francois, from a research production perspective, what would you qualify as a good evaluation and what does it imply?
Okay, I would insist really on 2 points. Following on your good and rigorous evaluation, I will insist first on the definition of outcome. The experience that we got, in particular with this very nice collaboration between EIB and GDN on evaluating several EIB projects, that very often the outcome is not clear, which means that evaluators are a bit confused about what they are looking for. But let me give you an example. If we look at microcredit operations, it seems to me that there are 2 different types of outcomes. One outcome would be we are interested by what a precise microcredit company is doing and the way in which its clients are doing. But even that, what matters? What does matter? Is it the fact that we want the clients to accumulate assets? Do we want the clients to, on the contrary, to be able to use the microcredit as a income smoother when they have a shock? Those 2 things are completely different. They are very important from a development point of view because they increase the welfare of those people, but the way in which we should go about it would be completely different. The kind of evaluation tools, the kind of data that we would need to evaluate those 2 key functions are completely different. And in another way, if we look at microcredit, another outcome would be for the funder to say we want to make sure that a microcredit company is able to sustain its activity over time and to become autonomous and to become independent from outside financiers. This is again something which is completely different. So my first point is really about this. Let's make sure that when somebody is investing in an impact project, that the outcome, the objective is completely clear and that evaluators will be told about it. My second point is about data. We were told yesterday that there were many data available in firms, and that to some extent you simply had to choose the data that you would use. I tend to agree if the point is to elaborate indicators or metrics of outputs, not necessarily outcomes. In general, what we have as information is information on inputs and outputs. We don't have direct information on outcomes. So if we want to evaluate, we have to go beyond this kind of data. And the point on which I want to insist is the fact that we need to have data that will allow us to do some kind of counterfactual analysis. Evaluation is comparability. Comparability is we need to make sure that we are comparing our results with what would have been the situation in the area where we are operating without our intervention. Now, this is very difficult, fully agree, but the point is that if the funders of impact projects do not insist with the investees on the fact that they need to collect data before implementing the project, so that at least it will be possible for them to do some before-after comparison. Still better to convince them to collect data on a control group, a control locality, whatever, in order to be able to compare, to do what we call diff and diff comparisons. Now, this will have no statistical value. My point is not to say that we have to do randomized control trials everywhere and everywhere. This is impossible and this would be too expensive. But at least to get this minimum information to be able to compare is something which is absolutely crucial. So what I would recommend as a researcher interested in this evaluation of impact investment is really to make sure that we are making progress in those two directions. And I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Francois. Let me now invite Zenda to talk. Zenda, from your experience, does the understanding of what an evaluation is about differ between the public and the private sector? And what do you think eventually matters most?
Thank you very much, Pierre. Yeah, as you can hear, I was to talk, or I am to talk to any specific challenges in evaluating private sector and impact public sector interventions and differences between this and what it might then mean for the utility of impact evidence. Now, we obviously need to be concerned not only with the use of an evaluation, but also with the impact of the use of an evaluation. So if they're used, they'd better be credible and useful. From my experience, there is not really a difference between interventions in the public and private sectors and how evaluations are performed. But so the challenges that are faced are quite similar, but perhaps more pronounced in the private sector, perhaps for several reasons. And I'd like to focus on that rather than talk about public sector challenges. In the private sector, mindsets and skills tend to be different, say, to the development sector. And incentives that drive private sector investments sometimes prevent transparency or full cost accounting approaches. There are obviously concerns about greenwashing and social washing, but the political economy of evaluation is always a challenge in all sectors. And we have to deal with that in order to ensure the credibility of the evaluations. Impact investing interventions tend to be more discrete and targeted at narrow interests, often without portfolio approaches that create synergies for deeper and broader impact. And it also seems as if private sector interventions do not yet make full use of the range of practices and experiences that exist in the field of evaluation when dealing with impact and the journey towards impact. I'm a natural scientist with a PhD in chemistry, and I've worked as a full-time evaluator now around the world. And I've actually grown to respect the field of evaluation. It's very relevant. It's got a broad body of and deep body of knowledge and wide experience. And so this mutual learning that we can do between people dealing with impact evaluation, economists, social science researchers, private sector specialists is very important at this point, especially since we know that development is not going well, despite our rhetoric about it. The recent reports have been devastating about what has been achieved over the last number of decades. Also because of 4 global crises bearing down on us, 4 more after the pandemic, evaluation clearly has to be the best it can be. So whether one works in the private sector or in the public sector with evaluation and impact evaluation, for me, there are a few things that I'd like to highlight as imperative if we have the kind of credibility and utility that can make for use of evaluation and for good impacts of the use of evaluations. I just quickly run through them. One, the passive provision of evidence to stakeholders, whether in the public or private sector domains, will not work. It should not just be about the final knowledge product. The evaluation process itself should be useful. And if we want people to use evaluations, we should involve them early on in the process and in empowering, not extractive only ways. Number 2, many investors do not yet realize the value of an organizational culture of learning based on regularly available evaluative evidence, It helps with risk management, with plans and decisions, and with ongoing adjustments to an intervention to improve the chance of impact. Learning, in other words, is crucial, but to implement this requires more timely evaluation processes, not just ex ante and ex post, but through efforts like rapid evaluations, evaluative reflection workshops, developmental evaluation, which is a type of evaluation that has been developed to support ongoing evidence-informed journey in order to ensure that what is done moves towards impact. So it also tracks impacts as they emerge, but it focuses also on many aspects around it. Number 3, we fool ourselves about the credibility of impact evaluations unless we also assess whether there is a chance that positive impacts will sustain. Otherwise, we cannot really talk about good impact, positive impact, and sustain long enough to contribute to development, because that's what we want to do, which itself is seldom well defined or well connected to the intervention. The positive impacts of microfinance interventions, for example, are known to vanish in many cases quite soon. And then, was it worthwhile? The chance that positive impacts will sustain depends in part on how the intervention is designed and implemented. We already know quite a lot about how to do and assess that. And of course, ideally, to claim real development success, we need to revisit the results after enough time has passed, yet we almost never do. A fourth quick point is that an impact evaluation is not useful or credible unless it systematically examines any negative consequences or impacts, or what would be called by economists externalities, as a result of the intervention, because they can obviously reduce or even completely neutralize the positive effects of an intervention without us knowing it unless we seek actively for it. It does not help that an effort to empower women increases domestic violence against her, for example. We can mitigate and work with that, but we need to know about that. Fifth point, we need to be much more sensitive about the extent to which local, formal and informal systems, context and cultures influence success, or our definitions of success. That varies a lot across cultures, but when we do theories of change, that's often not on the table. Among many others, it requires nuanced data that also tell us about issues of power, of gender dynamics, inclusion, whose voices are heard, and so on. These are all essential information to inform impact and how we assess impact. Sixth quick point, most importantly for me, is times are changing and we now need to focus less on measuring impact and more on how we can design and implement for impact using evaluative practice. We know today much more about how to do that. It requires a systems approach to life and to work. It requires what many call joined up thinking, working with interconnections and interdependencies as COVID-19 has so much exposed. It requires a complete mindset change about how we work with impact. We need to think about the systems, the unpredictability of what we do, about the fact that we need to adapt and be agile. And we don't change the part to make the part better without considering its impact on the whole system, that is. This means we need to shift to much more robust design thinking, using concepts such as leverage points, co-evolution, feedback loops, synergistic action adaptation, and so on. And that is a growing and already strong focus in the evaluation sector. Finally, all of this means that there is also a shift to much more qualitative data that can actually help us to understand patterns and relationships, not just the end result, because this is something that from a systems perspective now becomes very important. And some people talk of rich and warm versus big and cold data, qualitative, rich and warm data being data that explains relationships, that explains patterns that emerge. And this is often not in the skill set of people who do quantitative evaluation designs only, But that's a story for another time, and there's no more time. I think I'll just hand back to Pierre.
Thank you very much, Zenda. You have broadened the approach to evaluations, and I'm sure we'll pick that up in the discussions. Let me now turn to Deborah Rivoltella. Deborah, from your experience at the EIB, how does the logic and dynamics of impact evaluations interact with the logics and dynamics of operations? Are operational colleagues in the EIB buying the need for results measurement and impact evaluations? And what exactly do they buy in there?
Yeah, thank you very much, Pierre, and thank you very much for having done all this journey with us, talking about impact with the program that we have been developing in the last year and this fantastic conference in those days. I wanted to start mentioning something. Actually, we had this brief chat online coming from Francois' message that impact in the conference seems to be a vague message. It's not used in such a precise way. And that's definitely happening also in an institution like our institution, where you talk about the different stakeholders inside the institution and outside the institutions. And the message is that we see evolving is that basically when we talk about when we talk with most of our stakeholders, what they really wanted to understand is if we as an institution, so operating a public institution operating in the market, if on top of the volumes that we are lending, if this lending really makes a difference as an impact. So that's ultimately what they want to know. On the other side, there is the second element of the discussion that we have when in all the program we were working on impact finance envelope. So the point was, in that case, we were supporting activities that were supposed to have an even stronger impact on the market, and that was what we were looking for. Given that the message is so kind of vague in the understanding of our stakeholders, in the economics department, we have been working since the beginning to try to combine the different approach to contribute to the message of what is the value of what we do. And we have been working with different elements. On the one side, we have a project-by-project instrument that it's allowing us to look at project-by-project for all projects that we finance. It's basically looking at ex-ante expectation results, and somehow we still talk about impact, but the impact element is less stronger related to that. But it's our system where we try to understand what are the market failures that call us to intervene, what is the additionality that we can bring to the project, then the quality of the project, and then what the EIB really adds to the project. And that's happening in all our projects. Then we have, this is one part. The second element is related to macroeconomic modeling of impact. So we try to understand on top of all our activities in certain sectors or globally at the macroeconomic level, if we put it in a macroeconomic modeling, what is the effect in terms of GDP and net employment creation in the short term and in the long term. We are also working at this, but again, it's one of the elements of the analysis. And the third thing that we are trying to do is more and more use microeconometric or micro level studies to assess the impact of what we do. And in this part, we are developing a different kind of projects. On the one side, one example, we look at and it's very close to what Françoise was mentioning before. We look at firms that received our financing in the past. We do difference in different analysis, looking at firms that are identical ex ante but didn't receive our financing, and we check 3 years after how the performance of the firms have been evolving without our financing or with our financing. And we are trying to develop more and more this kind of projects. On top of this, we also were working on the GDN program, and that was slightly different because it was going very much in depth with the deep dive for different projects. But there we were trying to understand if this impact finance envelope that had a concessional component, and so the project were supposed to have an even stronger impact on the economy. We were trying to define what this even stronger impact is and verify it. So again, it's various ways of using the word impact, but all of these come together. And there is an important element with these different angles that I want also to clarify. And in this panel, I'm talking from the research department. Sabine will talk about the role of the evaluation department. I think the main difference, I think we are trying in the institution to bring all these deep understanding, the 3 elements that you were mentioning before, Pierre, the accountability, knowledge creation, learning and feedback loops. We are really trying also in what we do in the economics department to have the 3 elements embedded in what we do. We are very closely operating together with our operations department, so the learning and feedback loop are quite immediate in the work that we are doing. Some of the analysis that we do together with the operations, so it comes already embedded in the learning. The knowledge creation as well, what we do, we try to also share a lot with other institutions, have a lot of feedbacks, and have a think like the one we have. So having being very close to the best practice in order to be better aligned in terms of this knowledge creation. And then there is the issue of the accountability, and I think also the issue of accountability is very important because it requires on the one side the quality and quality recognition of what we do, and also the appropriate governance. And on that point, part of what we had together, so the GDN program, the scientific committee is extremely important because it gives a sense of top quality academic rigor behind the analysis that is being done. But again, as going back, I put a lot of elements, but what the key point that I wanted to pass is that in the current practice of institution, I think the word impact is used in a less defined way than what evaluators on the one side or economists on the others, researchers would use. Is used in a very wide sense. And with this understanding of stakeholders that is relatively wide, we have to combine different elements to still be linked to the rigor and the accountability, but to help bring the message of what we are really delivering, what is really, are we really making a difference? That's the real point that we have to demonstrate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. The floor now goes to Rabat. I hope he's with us because I don't see his picture on the screen, but he probably cut his camera. Yeah, welcome back, Rabat. Rabat, your experience has taken you through various stages of that interaction between knowledge and action. Among other responsibilities, you are now in charge of knowledge management at the African Development Bank. Knowledge management to do what? For what? What are the major challenges you think you will face?
Thank you so much, Pierre. I want to thank the EIB. Is the sound okay?
Yeah, no, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, we can.
It's good. So, yeah, no, I have some, yeah, very good. So thanks a lot for the kind invitation. Pierre has been a mentor throughout my career, so I'm very thankful also for the kind invitation today. Instead of talking about my current role, I thought I'll speak about the issue of feedback loops that Zenda and Deborah spoke at length about, but I'd like to raise the issue of the overlapping nature of these feedback loops. And in particular, I'd like to be specific about the fact that for me, the glass is half full on the micro project level loops, if you wish, the learning and the self-correction that's going on there is quite active. It has improved over the years. A lot remains to be done, but I see there as a glass half full. Where I am more worried about, and having been at the World Bank and now at the African Development Bank, where I worry there is less of that self-correction and learning happening is more between the micro and macro loops, or the project to the strategy level. And obviously, there many development institutions have been challenged. So let me say a word about how these different loops overlap. The first loop is more straightforward because we are dealing with specific project. An integrating ex-ante and ex-post evaluation framework does the trick because it allows to link knowledge and operation in a much more straightforward manner. But even so that's the case, it is important to have the ex-ante assessment and link that to the ex-post. There are lots of challenges there. I think Francois made that point. Most of the development have these frameworks. They have improved over the years. And I note there that the activism of staff has been key. I have seen also while I was at the IMF that staff pushing, being very activist on new analytical work, on pressing authorities, on gaining access to new data, including the new techniques of satellite imaging, phone survey, is really pushing the boundary and has led us to make a lot more progress. Where I think we really need to, where I think the glass is half empty, is on the more macro loops, as I mentioned. This is less straightforward because this requires a lot more aggregation. Aggregation from these multiple number of micro knowledge operation loops. And the aggregation in turn forces us to think about weighting. And when you think about weighting, you need to think about context, you need to inform replicability and scalability. And that's really where I think the challenge is, in my view. To put it bluntly, I think most development banks are struggling with the big ideas versus small project problem. And where we need to do a lot more is indeed to try and think more systematically about the complementarity between these more macro structural policies and the project level implementation. Often I hear senior management, senior leadership in the operational front push the staff and talk about moving away from potato chips project and demand from the staff that they do large operation. That, of course, is a very difficult and challenging task, because for that you need to dig deeper into the scaling up challenge. And we often refer to absorptive capacity or limits to absorptive capacity as a black box where we know very little and it's rarely unpacked in ways that I think the rigor that we have put to the more micro feedback loop has received. The direction of travel of development finance institution is currently balancing operation with the more upstream type of policy. This is the so-called cascade approach. I would add to that cascade approach, to that more upstream type of approach to achieving scale and bring together big ideas with big development outcome, the issue, for instance, in Africa, of regional integration, and also fixing financial systems, such as the channeling of domestic and foreign saving into much needed investment. The example of scaling up solar is telling, because a large FDI can only happen if we do fix the financial system in the continent to allow investors to use the number of instruments that they typically require in terms of currency swaps to hedge against risk, but also all the forms of financial repression that is preventing them from having access to this domestic financial system. I'll finish by saying that there are obviously internal issues that the organizational structure of different development banks is making the silos, the forever silo mentality, prevent that kind of aggregation of knowledge from this micro feedback loop to the more macro picture. And the World Bank had tried and tinker with that organizational structure by introducing global practices. I leave others to make a judgment on where we stand there. But clearly the thinking there was to try and cut across, having global practices that cut across operation and region, so that the knowledge diffusion and the strategy evolve accordingly. Academia has a very important role to play, but as you notice from academia, the internal logic is really driving what I see as corner solution in the literature, meaning that we went from the dominance of the development field by macro development, and we now move to the dominance of the field by more macroeconomists. And clearly, as development institution, we need to push to try and move away from this corner solution and stimulate the more macro world, considering the important needs we have in that area. I will stop here, and I want to apologize in advance because I have to leave in exactly 20 minutes for a board meeting, so apologies in advance.
Thank you very much, Rabah. You struck me as quite ambitious, trying to address this micro-macro relationship that is still quite poorly understood. And you're right, it's at the core of everything. So we'll come back to that as well. Thanks a lot. Our final speaker is Sabine Bernabé. Sabine, you are in charge of independent evaluations. In your experience, what are the main factors that make an independent evaluation useful for the other stakeholders? Would you see any tension between independence, which may sometimes carry a perception of judgment, and the appeal that evaluations could have as a learning tool within the institution?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pierre. And thank you to all the other speakers. This has been already an incredibly interesting and enriching event. So this question on how to ensure that that knowledge about impact is used by the institution is actually at the core of what the independent evaluation functions do in our institutions. It's in our day-to-day work to make sure that evaluation findings more broadly are useful and that they're actually used and that the institutions learn from them. I'd like to highlight 4 factors, which I think contribute to ensuring that evidence about knowledge and impact and evaluation more generally is used and ultimately influences decision-making. So the first is that evaluations need to address the questions that are relevant to our institutions. This may seem obvious, but I think it's quite critical. When setting our work program, for example, in EV, we consult broadly across the entire institution, across services, and then from the operational services all the way up to the board to ensure that, that we're focusing on topics and questions that are particularly relevant at that point in time for the institution. Second, I'd like to highlight, of course, timeliness. I think evaluations have to come at the right time, otherwise they have no influence. An example of this, we wrote a note as the COVID-19 pandemic was unfolding. The evaluation department produced a note for the bank's governing bodies, bringing together lessons learned from our previous evaluations, but also evaluations done by other IFIs that could be useful in designing the bank's current response to the crisis. And this came at the right time and influenced and and was useful. The third factor that I'd like to highlight is, of course, credibility, and we've talked about this already. The previous speakers have talked about this. And for credibility, I think two things are very important. So first of all, quality. Of course, our evaluations have to be built on rigorous methods and solid evidence to be credible, but also objectivity and impartiality. And in fact, I think this is an important factor. It's the impartial nature of independent evaluations which make them particularly valuable to the board and contribute to ensuring the credibility and ultimately influencing decision-making and learning. And finally, the fourth point is, which is specific to independent evaluation functions, but nevertheless very important for learning, I think, is, as you know, we issue recommendations. Our evaluations issue recommendations for management, which means that in addition to assessing impact and what works, we also need to think about how to implement the lessons learned from impact evaluations or evaluations. And this is, the fact that we're pushed to think about how, we've learned some very interesting lessons, but how can the institution actually implement these and change is important. And in order for this change to happen, we have to make sure that we issue recommendations that are relevant, that are actionable, and that are followed up. And then this last point is not a minor point, because since we track the implementation of recommendations and we update the board on their implementation, there's also a little bit of this top-down pressure, which is, I think, also important for learning. The second point I would just like to talk about briefly is the implications in terms of the product mix and methods. And here I'd like to emphasize 2 points. So first of all, I mean, as we all recognize, we're living in a very fast changing world. And in order to bring evidence to the right audiences in the right format at the right time, I think at least the independent evaluation functions really need to broaden their product mix. So while thematic and project evaluations are, of course, still very important and needed, we need to expand to other types of products as well. For example, systematic reviews, which synthesize available evidence and help to inform decision-making. Another good example that Zena mentioned as well is real-time evaluations, so which aim to provide more, these are requests coming from governing bodies, I mean, our boards and management committees, to provide more rapid insights, more rapid evidence to decision makers. And so, for example, we're launching a rapid assessment of the bank's response to the COVID crisis. That's just an example. And second, and here coming a little bit to the core of our discussion today, while expanding our product mix, we need to really build on rigorous methods. And this is essential to ensure credibility and influence. And of course, impact evaluations, and by impact evaluations here, I'm talking about counterfactual based approaches, including deep dives, are extremely valuable as they bring rigor to evaluations. And I fully agree with Zena on the need and the value of using mixed methods approaches and of combining quantitative and qualitative impact evaluations with other sources of data and other type of analysis. I think deep dives and other forms of counterfactual based approaches are useful to answer targeted focused questions, for example, that you can then triangulate with other sources of data. They're also very useful when looking into pilot projects for which the evidence base hasn't yet been built. And because they require close collaboration with operational teams, they do contribute to building an evaluation culture and a stronger culture of results in the institution, which is, of course, important. At the same time, I think, at least from our perspective, there are some challenges in using these methods. First, the limited external validity of deep dives and more generally impact evaluations. It makes it difficult, of course, as we know, to draw general conclusions that can feed into the decision making. And that's why, again, we try to use them as one source of evidence, which we can then triangulate with other sources of evidence, and in order to be able to provide general conclusions that can then feed into decision making. And also, as we know, okay, they're relatively costly in terms of time and resources. And so, of course, every time we start an evaluation, we have to ask ourselves whether conducting an impact evaluation is worth the cost. But I have to say that because of this external validity issue and the cost consideration, one cost-effective way of using the evidence from impact evaluations is to make use of systematic reviews, as I was talking. But I do think that as a public bank, the EIB also has a role to play in building the body of evidence available, and hence in conducting impact evaluations and deep dives, and contributing to the public good nature of evaluation. I think this is important. I stop here and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabine. Let me invite all participants to join the chat to ask questions. We don't have questions right now, so it's an opportunity for all of you there to participate. So let me ask François to come back, because François highlighted some conditions for rigorous evaluations that make sense. What we heard after that was a broad endorsement of these ideas, but at the same time, we had a description of all the constraints that are there as well. So my question to François is whether in dirty real situations, researchers should step back and say we have little to bring there because the conditions for rigorous work are not there, or whether, as you accepted to do with the deep dive exercise, we can find ways to accommodate a little bit so that academic research can still be rigorous, provide insight, but it will stop short of what a final impact evaluation would be. What is, as a researcher, what is your view about that?
I would tend to say that it depends on my age. If I am a young guy to get an academic career, then I have to go for really striking evaluation with a lot of rigor, which will be completely clean from a statistical point of view. But now, if I'm an older guy with some experience, I know, and I completely convinced with what was said about external validity and this kind of thing, that it may not be worth spending a huge amount of money and a huge amount of time and human capital in doing that. What we want is to learn about how things work. And then I'm not sure that we really need statistical rigor to say there is only 5% probability that I will be wrong in saying that this project had an impact on the poverty or had an impact on the health. So this is really what I believe is a distinction which is important. When I was in the World Bank, and when I started with this DIME project in the World Bank, there was already this new wave of research in academia, which was about randomized controlled trial. And I remember that I had to fight some people saying, but what you're proposing is not rigorous. I mean, we cannot be sure about the kind of evaluation based on a single comparison before, after, or between two regions or two localities. And yes, I mean, this is true. But unfortunately, we need this kind of less rigorous evaluation in order to accumulate knowledge, in order to accumulate pragmatic knowledge. And in order to some extent to understand what should be investigated in more depth. And this is where I wanted to come. And listening to what has just been said by Zenda, Deborah, Rabah, and Sabine, I believe that from the point of view of organizations which are funding impact projects, there is a need to have a strategy of evaluation. You don't need to evaluate everything in depth. Certainly not the case, and it is too expensive, And I'm not sure that it would be useful. So you need to identify issues on which you believe that you need more knowledge, and then be able to figure out a few projects on which that in-depth evaluation will be done. And when this is done, then you may develop indicators, metrics, qualitative, quantitative, it doesn't matter, that will help you to understand what is going on in other projects without the in-depth evaluation. And in other projects, you need, maybe at the beginning, only a simple evaluation because you first want to understand what the issues are. So it seems to me that what is missing to some extent, but this applies only to organizations which have enough funds to some extent, which are the size of which is enough important. There is a need for such a strategy, and I didn't see it. And I can tell you that when I was in the World Bank, I was trying to convince people that there should be a strategy on this, and I never succeeded. But yet, it seems to me that given the importance that evaluation at 10, 15 years, I think it is really time to think along these lines.
Thank you very much. Let me invite other panelists to react to that. I think there is a sort of underlying tension between, again, accountability, which seems to require being able to evaluate everything you do, because you have to account for what you do and to explain the users that you made with the funds and the impact that you had across the board. And what you suggest, which is to have an evaluation strategy with choices and with specific directions. Sabine, Deborah, and of course Zenda and Rabah, reactions to what François said before we move to the next set of questions?
I may
Deborah.
start saying, adding something. I think I very much agree on the point that we as institution, we have to evaluate. And I distinguish also evaluation for me is Sabine, is the evaluation function, but we do it also as a part of the research and the business activities of the bank. So, but we have to evaluate everything that we do. We have to demonstrate that everything that we do has an impact. So in practice, we cannot always do everything with the best possible instruments. So we have to combine and use different instruments and different methodologies and trying to do the best that we can, but we really have to cover the full spectrum of what we do. And then there are areas, I think it's true that we may invest much more efforts in certain cases. There are, I say something specific, and François is very close to what you were saying at the beginning. You were talking about the using intermediaries, like if you use a microcredit institution, we use a lot of venture capital funds in Europe also for our own activities, or the banks for intermediating to SME. If you use intermediaries, you really need to invest a lot to understand what's the impact of what we do on the intermediaries, but also on the final beneficiaries. And that's deserve more investment, and we are trying to do. Maybe we start more from Europe, where we have a biggest part of the work, but we are starting and trying to do it also for more and more also in a systematic way also in other areas of our operations. So I think that is true. We have to demonstrate everything. We have to do analysis on everything that we do. So we have to use a combination of instruments, and there is a rationale for putting more effort, particularly when you use mechanism for your own operations, like using intermediaries, where the risk that things go wrong are even stronger. Another thing that I wanted to mention in terms of the learning process, when we launched the joint program, so the EIB GDN program, we had this impact finance envelope, and we were targeting a particularly private sector, mostly counterpart. And then we were working with the private sector to develop this deep dive for impact. I think an essential gain or learning of the process has been to talk with the promoter and have the private sector promoter having in mind that they needed to do more to understand the impact part of their project. So part of the learning is also the interaction with the promoter that needs to understand, to build these ways for analyzing the impact. And that's even only the dialogue between the researchers, the scientific committee, and the promoter, even before the study was put in place, was already a learning. And that's, for me, is already something quite interesting and quite remarkable of the exercise that we put in place. Another thing that I wanted to add in the discussion, and it comes from the very first thing that Francois was mentioning, the data. Data is a disaster everywhere. We as an institution, we have our own problem with our own data. Let's imagine on the building of all these exercises. What I'm trying to do more and more is to try to see if the big data offers some opportunity for some very nice evaluations, something for the future. We are trying to look into it. We are actually trying to see if there are some quick way to learn how to use this data for impact studies as well.
But there was actually a question on data and whether they could be a game changer. There seems to be a sort of paradox in these discussions. On the one hand, some people say there are a lot of data and there is a big data revolution, so it's a new era. And some other would say data are a catastrophe, and we are trying to fight with it. So how do we, François, you want to come in on that, I see.
Yeah, no, very small point. On big data first, you have to realize that big data are big, but these are selected. They have a selection bias. And because of that, it is difficult to work with them. Now, the main point I wanted to make is, and I forgot to make it when in my first intervention, is the fact that data are quite important. But I would say that investors, rather than investees, have to cover the cost of the data. It is costly for the investee to make sure that all the data are being collected. In the World Bank, when we were trying to evaluate policies, and we were telling governments, oh, you have to evaluate that, and you have to make a big survey to do that, then people were saying, okay, but you are interested in it, so please pay for the survey. It is the same thing in a much smaller project. And this is something that I believe matters very much for the efficiency of the whole process.
I see Zenda would like to take the floor, and let me mention a question to you, Zenda, and I was going to support that question as well. You mentioned that there is no culture of learning within private companies most of the time. So it's nice to regret it, but what do you think we could do about it? How can that change, and what are the factors of change? And of course, feel free to react to the earlier part of the discussion as well. Zenda.
Thank you. Just first of all, a quick comment about the data, because there's also in the chat box a question about the use of qualitative data and more of that. This is, as you all probably know, a very long-standing debate and ideological difference between people who do evaluations, where some say that qualitative is as equal to quantitative and vice versa, or superior or whatever. Where things have moved is the following. Number one, widely recognized across the evaluation community, including the impact evaluation community, is the extreme value of qualitative data to help answer not just what the impact was, but why, how, for whom, under what circumstances, with whose values, at what cost, and so on. So it's very important to add qualitative information and good quality qualitative information to any impact evaluation. That's number one. Number two, there is a movement now, as I said, towards rich and warm data, and these are not just lightly used concepts. Dave Snowden, who is a world expert in systems and complexity thinking, has recently used the argument that we need to combine big data with, or the advantage of big data, which is a lot of quantitative information, with the strength of qualitative information. The reason why qualitative information is often problematic is it's seen as not very systematically collected, with some bias and so on. But if you use tools like SenseMaker, which is something that Snowden developed, to get large samples of qualitative narratives in very systematic ways with some self-interpretation, but also providing the kind of triangulation that makes it very valuable. Then one gets much closer to combining quantitative and qualitative data in ways that work for both and build on the strengths of both. And it will be great if we can then get to a stage where we don't argue about the merit of one above the other anymore. So it's really important that we engage with this. Also, if we do move towards a much more appropriate thought process and methodology around the fact that things are interconnected and not as predictable as our methodologies would like us to believe, then it is very important that we engage far more with qualitative information in an ongoing way to adapt in order to increase the chance of impact as we implement, as we design and implement. And for that, qualitative information is absolutely crucial. In order for, and there's much known, if one would open almost any resource in evaluation, many books and articles discuss these issues in great detail and depth. The culture of learning, there are probably companies that do culture of learning well, but and certainly there are major companies that have done a lot of work in this, but there is a general perception that this is very problematic, and because evaluative evidence is not available in a timely manner, it doesn't support learning. There's a lot that has been experienced and found about how this can be advanced. It does depend, like everything, on the particular context of the company. It depends extremely on leadership promoting it and establishing good practices around it. And what I'll do is I'll put in the chat box just a link. I think, in fact, Cecile Kuster spoke yesterday in one of the sessions briefly about it. There is a very good resource on how one can establish a culture of learning in organizations, but with a caveat that everything depends on the culture in the first place of an organization. The bottom line is that one needs to display the value of that learning, the use of evaluative evidence in learning processes and in reflections. I worked for 6 years with a very big program across Africa where we built the learning element in throughout, and it served everybody very well. But that also responds to another issue that was raised. Failing is often seen as a big problem. You don't want to expose yourself to failure. But that is actually something that should be a fallacy. It should be completely erased, because if we use evidence-informed learning to improve the chance of impact, then failure should just be considered as another input into that process. And then failure takes on a completely different dimension. So the key issue here is to use evaluative evidence in time to enhance the chance of impact, be adaptive, be flexible, and take opportunities to learn. I'll put some resources in the chat box to demonstrate that.
Thank you very much, Zenda. I think it's appropriate to go back to Sabine because a number of issues that you have raised directly interact with what she said themselves. But I had a broader question for Sabine as well. I see a sort of contradiction between, or tension at least, between your focus on making recommendations and the focus on providing timely input in a sort of feedback process. It seems to me that the instrument of feedback are not recommendations. People who act are not going to wait for you to tell them what to do. They will decide that by themselves. So I don't think they will be very, very sensitive to recommendations made by a third party. At the same time, they may be very, very sensitive to a piece of knowledge that arrives at a timely moment and that is going to affect their own understanding about what they do. So how do you react to that? I would like to push you a little bit on this focus on output, results and recommendations, and ask you what is needed to sustain a more proactive feedback loop.
Thank you. Thanks, Pierre. Maybe just before answering that question, I would just like to strongly agree with what Zenda just said again about the value of mixed methods. And I think it's a really important message in this, especially because we focus so much here on the quantitative aspects, but as Zenda pointed out, the qualitative side can really help us to understand how and why and for whom and so on. Regarding well, this apparent contradiction between making recommendations and then the timely feedback loops. I think both. First of all, we make the independent evaluation functions within our institutions make recommendations to the institution itself, right? So this is these are the readers or the main stakeholders, and I think both are important. Both the process and Zenda was talking about this. The process of the evaluation is very important, and I think engagement with the institution during if we're evaluating an EIB program or mandate or whatever it might be, the engagement is extremely important with services, with the board, with the management throughout the evaluation, because the learning happens throughout the evaluation. And in fact, we have had frequently situations where our recommendations, by the time we issued them, were obsolete or no longer relevant because the institution had already taken them on board when the evidence was presented during the process. So, I mean, of course, those are very positive events that show the value of the evaluation process itself. At the same time, so I do agree, and I think that the feedback loops come throughout the process, and when the important evidence becomes available. At the same time, I think, and I was saying this in my opening remarks, that there is, in institutions like ours, the fact that we issue recommendations that are then communicated and reported to the board and to the management of the institution creates a kind of top-down pressure to implement change, because change doesn't, it's not necessarily going to happen just because we come out with lessons learned. Institutions resist change often and are not so keen on taking their own initiative to change based on the findings. So this second aspect is, I think, also important to ensure that change happens. And the last big thing I wanted to say is in reaction to something Deborah said about accountability and learning and building an evaluation culture. I think this is the business of the whole institution. I mean, evaluation is the business of the whole institution. It's not the business of independent evaluation. And building evaluability into projects, into programs ex ante is something, that is the business of the whole institution, and not just of the independent evaluation function. Of course, we play a big role in that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We are actually reaching the end of this very rich discussion. Before handing the floor to Ricardo and to François, let me give each of you 2 minutes to leave the panel with the remark that you would like to leave the panel with, basically, and maybe when that happens, also to deal with some of the questions that remain and that were raised in the chat. One of the questions to Zenda was about how to work across institutions, and that's something that, of course, is valid not only, and to Sabine, not only for evaluation departments within institutions, but across institutions, and of course to the evaluative work conducted with the private sector. And others' questions were in line with the discussion that we had about changing cultures and so on. If you also feel like, please comment about the timing of evaluations. I was just responding to Zenda on the chat that most of the evaluations today are conducted either ex ante, to design a project, or ex post, to see whether the project had an impact. So the contribution that evaluative work could make in between is most of the time lost, because there is no investment to work with researchers during the action. And to some extent, the deep dives were a first element of response to that. It would be nice to hear your views about whether that has a future, and whether we should invest more in this during implementation evaluations. So let me start with François. Let me use the same order as we had in the discussion. François.
Okay, so some final comments. No, I believe that it is important to recognize that there are different types of evaluation, and I'm sympathetic to the view which has been expressed here. The fact that in institutions like EIB or the bank or all those development banks, there is a need for evaluation of projects. And this does not need to be deep dive, this does not need to be a very precise and rigorous evaluation. But in order to improve, even though regular evaluations, we need to have somewhere more experience with in-depth evaluations. And we need to have more experience with different methodologies. Personally, I'm not at all against qualitative method versus quantitative method. I completely agree with the fact that we may not need to use mixed methodologies, but we need to have methodologies which may be different depending on the kind of projects we're evaluating. But the point is that, and I'm coming back to my idea of a strategy, the point is that we must learn from in-depth analysis something about how to be better in doing not every day, but regular evaluations of projects. In other words, we need to learn from in-depth exercises. And to some extent, it seems to me that this is what is missing today. And the related point is that we also would need to have more externalities, in the sense that we would need to exchange more systematically about what one institution has learned and what another institution has learned, and to be able to share this knowledge that we're accumulating. And this conference today was extremely interesting, very important, and I believe that it should be a kind of a starting point for this kind of exchange.
Thank you, François. Zenda?
One of my African colleagues said to me long ago during a fiery, not to me, but during a fiery exchange with an investor, she said, "This is not about your project. This is about my country." And these words always stay with me, because it is an indication of the responsibility that we carry as evaluation specialists. And we have to recognize that the challenges before us has been changing, and there are also reasons why development and poverty reduction have not proceeded as we thought it should. Evaluation is clearly not playing the role it should, neither is impact evaluation. And it is really important that we all try to improve practice in line with the understanding that matters are far more complex, that it is not anymore about having micro interventions that we try to aggregate at a macro level, that if we don't understand the field of systems, complex systems work, evaluation and impact evaluation will never achieve, it will never be the best it can be for this time. It requires the I'm talking about, and I just don't see how the field of evaluation and our impact, our own impact, will advance unless we now engage with that fully, with a frame of mind that the obsession with measuring impact should be replaced with an obsession to understand better how to design and implement for impact. And that means that we should be far more agile, more adaptive, and there are many ways in which practitioners are now understanding how to do that. So I would just like to urge all of us to move far more vibrantly into that space. It is really essential.
Thank you very much, Zenda. Deborah, 2 minutes.
Yes. So thank you. I think I use my 2 minutes just to summarize and go a little bit along the line of what both Françoise and Zenda just said. I think it's what we said before is we as an institution, we have to prove that everything that we do really has an impact as we intended to it from the beginning. So we have the challenge of really covering all the activities that we do with this kind of impact analysis that we are discussing. Given data limitation, given cost consideration, we necessarily have to use different methodologies and experiment different methodologies. And the combination of the different methodologies help us to have the full picture. And then I think the very important point is what we said before, the quality of what we do, it needs to be really credible. And here the rule of our scientific committee in the GDN EIB program is crucial, and really making sure that there is some quality assurance, and behind the quality assurance, even if the quality assurance understands that there may be some analysis that are more rigorous, some that are still good, acceptable, but they all build to the to build. They all contributed to build the whole picture. And the last point that Françoise was mentioning, sharing with other institutions, I think it's crucial. We are trying to do it a lot. I think what we are doing now in this conference is a clear example. We had quite a lot of sharing with different institutions and different methodologies and different approaches, and it's already part of learning. And I think it would be really useful to continue to think at, consider it as a starting point to build on for the future. So thank you very much, and it's really something we should leverage on.
Thank you very much. Sabine, as it should, for evaluations. You almost have the last word.
Okay, thank you, Pierre. I'll be super short. Maybe I'd just like to have a bit of a forward-looking thought. And I think we're, as Zenda said, we're living in a very complex and, as I said before, fast-changing world. I mean, this is, at least for evaluators, is very clear because we're in the business of looking backward, and retrospective studies might not seem so useful in this very fast changing world. And so I really think we need to think and rethink and think again about what it means, what accountability means beyond, as you were saying before, beyond just accounting exercise, and what learning means in this context, and how we can do it both in our institutions and across the evaluation community at large. And I think that these kinds of events where we cooperate across institutions, across evaluation stakeholders, to try to push the boundaries, to think about methods, about products, about how we can be useful and credible and push the boundaries are extremely important, because generally I think that evaluation has been quite slow at innovating compared to other professions. And I think so these kinds of events are extremely useful.
Thank you very much. Two very, very brief comments, takeaways from my side. The first one is that we talked about rigor and quality, and it was very apparent in the discussion that rigor and quality are not defined by methods. And that's something that I want all of us to keep in mind, because very often the association between quality and method is made. And quality is much more than that. It is actually using a method in an appropriate way. And this is something very, very different from simply using a method. And the second point is to rebound on what Zanda said about this quote, about this is not about your project, it's about my country. This is exactly what, together with the EIB, we decided that these deep dives, which were actually an evaluative exercise, would have to be combined with capacity building to involve researchers from developing countries, because we are talking about their context and their countries. And it is, for me, one of the very big value added of this program. And I want to thank the partners at EIB for the wonderful experience that we had in doing so. So let me declare this panel closed. Thank you very much for, I think, a very rich discussion. And you're right, it should go on. And I hope that we can continue in the same lines. Let me go give the floor to our two final speakers who will help us take with us the main messages from this conference, and give the floor to Ricardo. Thank you, Ricardo. And please put your mic on.
Oh, sorry. Is it on now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Thank you, Pierre. I hope I can deliver on what you asked me for. I'd like to start by thanking the Global Development Network and to our chief economist, Deborah Revoltella, and their team for putting together this event. I would also like to thank to the moderators for keeping these discussions flowing, and I'm very impressed how you've managed this. I know a lot of work must have gone into the organizational part behind the scenes. So thanks also to Professor François Bourguignon and to the other 4 expert advisors that have supported the program put up by the European Investment Bank and the Global Development Network very strongly from the start and challenged us to make this research a success. I would also like to congratulate you and thank the African researchers who share their findings and their experience at this event. It's in fact their economies. You have many new and valuable insights from them. Everyone here had something unique to contribute and to teach us. I'm quite new to the European Investment Bank, and this event, be sure, was very, very inspirational for me. It's our job as the EU bank to be an impactful investor. We work every day to improve the living standards of humankind, to preserve the environment, and boost the economies inside and outside the European Union borders. Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific regions are of high priority for us. In 2019, we invested 1.4 billion euros in these regions, in 42 projects that worth almost 6 billion euros in total. This included 85 million euros of investment in high impact projects with private sector partners under the impact financing envelope. In my role as EIB Vice President, I analyze these exciting and innovative projects that come to my desk. These projects are truthful evidence of the global, multilateral, and multicultural face of the ambition of this bank. I get to see very detailed reports from our technical teams, and I can tell you that I read them with excitement about the development impact we aim to achieve. Just to give you an example, we are expecting the equity funds that we supported in Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific regions to finance over 180 dynamic private sector firms and to create more than 25,000 jobs. This is what we aim for. We have an important contribution to sustainable and inclusive development in these regions to make the difference. But the evidence you provide over the past days has added to that. It has showed us the stories of the real economy, the impact in people's lives that lie behind the numbers. That is what makes the difference, improving the lives of millions of citizens around the world. What we have heard confirmed that the European Investment Bank is achieving a strong development impact in Africa, making a concrete difference on the ground. But I believe there is potential to do even better and achieve more. And we can do it, and we will do it, and I have no doubt that we'll deliver. I can go with reassured confidence into any discussions about the role of the IB outside you. We are a tried and tested instrument for development impact, and I'm sure that with the support of our stakeholders, we'll achieve even more. These discussions have brought home the importance and the usefulness of impact measurement. Just a few years ago, it was quite a new idea that we had to measure impact, to justify the use of public funds. I know that sometimes we feel like it is just one more task to tick off. This is not what I think the case anymore in most cases. Any public institution, and this is very important, must justify their budget to the taxpayers. Transparency matters. We are the EU banks, so we have to be fully transparent and accountable to our stakeholders. And events like this are actually a part of how we should achieve that. These events make sure that a wider audience sees the way we work, the methods and the frameworks we use, and can provide us with the feedback and new ideas to move forward every day, to learn every day. We really gain from this type of exchange. Yet, it is not only a question of accountability or transparency. It is a matter of understanding that policy options always have a cost, most times a shadow cost. We need to justify every day, every penny that we use, and to show that this is the best use for money that our taxpayers can enjoy, and I'm sure of this. Thus, impact measurement has become a second nature of our institution. There is no question. It is a core part of our business model. This event has shown how we can push even further with our impact measurement work, moving beyond pure accountability towards leveraging the knowledge to deliver the most we can on the ground. We need to be flexible and adaptable. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we are adapting the way we work to meet the needs of our stakeholders. In this conference, we have seen that impact measurement is no exception. We have seen examples how the researchers had to adapt their plans. We have to adapt, to keep adapting, using the newest techniques and data sources to stay relevant and make the best use of the resources we have available. Of course, the deep dives that Global Development Network help us to produce are part of our broader framework for measuring impact. This shift from pure accountability towards learning by doing and measuring impact is something we are working on across all the streams, pushing ourselves to the limits to achieve development effectiveness wherever we work. In the past days, made it clear that we are working around these same issues and questions. And it is through these discussions, sharing ideas, confronting ideas, discussing ideas, that we learn from each other. I conclude with a clearer message. I'm looking forward to continuing this fruitful discussion. The EIB will continue to work as your impact investors. Thanks to you all for your hard work. I'm sure that we'll meet in person as soon as this pandemic crisis fades out. Stay safe. Wish you a great 2021 and gold rings on you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. François.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for those words and for stating so clearly the importance of evaluation for EIB and the benefit that EIB drew from this collaboration with the Global Development Network. So this conference, which was organized jointly by EIB and GDN, really built on this collaboration that we had. But we were fortunate enough to also benefit from the participation of all the major players in this field, from analysts to investors to professional evaluators to companies. And we also have to thank all those organizations for which evaluation is important, which joined us, like GEAN, IFC, EDFI, DG, IMP, Convergence, 3IE, AFDB, ODI, the World Bank, and many others for a very nice contribution. But let me now maybe come to the topics and what I believe we have learned, or what we can draw from those 3 days and 5 sessions. I think that the starting point would be to say that there is definitely a tremendous need for investment in the developing world. There have been all those evaluations about what was needed to reach the SDGs by 2030, and these are $1 trillion. I will not get into this kind of calculation. But on the other hand, we also know that there is, and this is something which has been said during those days, that there is a lot of liquidity over there. And maybe there has never been so much liquidity in the world as of today. So the real issue is, how is it possible to have this liquidity being put to work for the development objective? And then you have the good news, which is the fact that it is the case that some private investments are at the same time extremely valuable for investment, for development, in the sense that not only they provide more income to people within the country, but they contribute to something else within the development process. They contribute to better infrastructure, that contribute to better behavior, more rigorous management, many ways. A project, even though this is not part of its benefits, because there is no market for this kind of sustainability, projects really provide huge benefits for the development process. And what evaluation is really about this aspect. What is making the private project at the same time a project which is important from the development point of view? And if we want to weaken or to strengthen the appetite of those who are sitting on liquidity to invest them on development, probably this evaluation of the externalities of private projects is absolutely essential. And it is essential in order to provide the evidence that it is important and it is rational to invest in those projects to favor development, but it is also quite crucial in the sense that by developing evaluation, we will be contributing to an increment in the stock of knowledge available. And this also should be an argument for the investors, for those who are managing those liquidity, to put more on the side of development and the developing countries. So from that point of view, we can consider that evaluation plays a huge role and an increasing role today in trying to facilitate the process of development. So this is about the goal, and I believe that during those 3 days we heard about this need and the deep usefulness of impact evaluation in that sense. Now, what about the process, or what about the more technicalities of the evaluation, which also has been maybe more the core of the discussion of the last couple of days. Now, the point is that on the one hand, we have made progress in measuring performances of projects. And the GIIN, for example, has provided us with metrics, with indicators, with benchmarking to some extent, with normalizing performances so that it is possible to get an idea about how successful, the kind of contribution that the project is making to development. This is extraordinarily useful, and this needs to be improved. This is a huge progress over the past. I remember my days in the World Bank where I had at some stage to start an evaluation of the IFC. And I remember those days in which IFC was saying that, look, we are doing very well because our financial return is very high. They were not wrong. There was only one thing missing, which was the fact that they had to show that the financial returns were high, but at the same time that the project they undertook were additional projects. Without them, those projects would not have been invested, would not have been implemented. And it is a little the kind of issue that we have with only looking at performances. This is good. There are good results. I'm happy to see that we are going much beyond financial indicators to get into development indicators, but we need more than that. We need to say something about additionality. So we need to say something about what this project has changed in the development environment. And this is the reason why we need more than measuring performances. We need to evaluate the true contribution of a project to the development process. Now, this is extremely difficult, extremely complex. We have heard about many different methodologies, many different approaches, and I don't think that we can say that one is good and another one is wrong. This is not true. We have many different types of projects. We have many different types of investors. We have many different types of communities where projects are being implemented. We have very different types of countries. So because of that, we cannot say that there is one methodology and one way of going about evaluation. And I believe this is what has been making these 3 days very rich, in the sense that we could see that diversity. And at the same time, it's a bit frightening in the sense that if there is so much diversity, then what should we do? And because of that, I think that it is important to have in mind that the kind of deep dive analysis which was made within this EIB-GDN collaboration, and the kind of evaluation that academics are doing very seriously. We think about all those randomized controlled trials of microcredit, for example, which have been extremely useful, even though they said, we're not sure about what microcredit is really bringing to development. But this has been extremely important because without that, we would not be able to even say something about what is the impact. I mean, we would rely only on our ex-ante view about, oh, providing credit necessarily is a good thing. So my point here is, in the continuation of what I said in the previous session, is to say that we should make sure that we work on those in-depth evaluations in several areas, not for all projects, certainly not, this is not possible, but let's make sure that we have enough opportunities to deepen our knowledge about what those projects, those more or less typical projects undertaken by the private sector may bring to development, so that we can feed the more standard evaluations done on a regular basis of all projects with what we have learned from those in-depth evaluations. And from that point of view, I believe that we need to use all the methodologies which are possible. We need to make sure that we are collecting the data that are needed. And from that point of view, investors, impact investors must also contribute to this collection of data. But and finally, we need to make sure that there is some instances, some ways of sharing the knowledge that we are acquiring through those evaluations. And maybe this conference, this EIB-GDN conference that we have these days, maybe kind of a starting point for exchanging on this. We already have this kind of institution for public evaluation. I mean, CIE, for example, is typically doing this kind of thing. But maybe we should think about trying to expand that to make sure that all what is being done more on the private sector side is also being shared in an effective way. But there are many other issues that I could talk about. I mean, I think that I need to start very quickly. I could have talked about also some issues which have been discussed here. For example, the management for impact, which I thought was a very interesting view. The way in which within companies, within institutions, there is some strategy about using impact evaluation and providing evaluation. But we learn also about the way in which we could, the point about managing was more a portfolio issue than a project by project. But my time is up, and so let me simply conclude by saying that I believe that we helped push the frontier, and we moved somewhat from discussing the way in which development impact must be evaluated, must be assessed, but to think in a more collective way about the way in which this should be done. Development is a collective issue. Development is truly, of course, at the project level, at the regional level, at the country level, but we know that at the end, development is a global issue, is a collective issue. And from that point of view, the kind of discussion that we had these last couple of days are start for trying to mobilize this new accumulation of knowledge through impact evaluation of impact investment to the overall goal of development. So thank you very much for those days. Thank you for all the people who attended this conference. I hope that you got what you were expecting from this conference. And thank you very much for all the speakers whom we heard for the last 3 days. This has been really a very, very nice event. So thank you very much for the organizing. Thank you very much.